Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Highlands. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1853, a year before the Missouri borderlands began to crack under the pressure that would soon ignite the conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. The frontier then was a place of unsteady silence, dense forests, drifting fog, and a strange calm that seemed to wait for something to begin. It was into that silence that a man walked. Barefoot, coatless, and carrying nothing but a folded letter, he arrived in the small Ozark town of Rolla one gray morning in March. He called himself Isaac Granger, and when asked his age, he smiled faintly and said, "I was born when the field still had kings." No one knew what he meant. He spoke softly, politely, and with a strange kind of distance, as if he had lived too long to be surprised by anything. The town constable, Hiram Blaine, took him in, thinking he might be a runaway slave. Yet Isaac bore no brand or scar of ownership. The folded letter he carried bore an emblem from a plantation that had burned decades earlier. Its few surviving words read, "This man remembers what no one should. Keep him safe." The local physician, Dr. Josiah Mott, examined him and recorded his findings in a county log that still survives. Mott described the man as dark of skin, gray of hair, but sound of limb and mind, eyesight strong, pulse steady, age impossible. He estimated Isaac to be near 70, but his manner, the steadiness of his step and clarity of speech, betrayed someone younger. Isaac was given work at the stables, where his quiet strength and uncanny endurance unsettled even the hardest men. He could haul barrels alone that usually required three. He could stand in cold rain without shivering. He never seemed to sleep. Yet what drew the town's unease wasn't his labor, it was his memory. He spoke casually of things that no living man could have seen. He mentioned battles from a century earlier with details that matched the forgotten French records of Fort de Chartres, events known then only to scholars. When someone asked how he knew, he simply said, "I was standing where the bullets fell." By summer, whispers spread that Isaac Granger had lived through more than one lifetime. Old trappers swore they'd seen him before, in 1820, in 1790, even back when the French still roamed the highlands. He had not aged, they said, only changed his coat. Whether myth or miracle, the truth began quietly that year, with one man who seemed to carry the entire memory of a country on his back. By early 1854, the name Isaac Granger had woven itself through the Ozark Highlands like a quiet rumor. Men in Rolla began avoiding the stable where he worked. Women crossed the street rather than meet his steady gaze. It wasn't hostility so much as discomfort. Isaac seemed like a reminder of something no one wanted to remember. The local schoolmaster, Albert Kinney, took interest in him after reading Dr. Mott's strange medical notes. Kinney visited Isaac one evening, hoping to document the man's stories for a frontier almanac. What he recorded still survives in fragments. He spoke of the sky as though it were a book already written, said he had been born under it twice. When I asked where, he said, "Virginia, then the floodplain." I asked when, and he smiled before men named the rivers. Kinney asked if he had ever been a slave. Isaac nodded slowly and said, "Once." Then again and again under different names. Every master thought he bought the first of me. The teacher thought it poetry until Isaac began listing owners. French, English, American, each from different centuries, all historically traceable. One name, De Vere of New Orleans, belonged to a plantation that had burned in 1791, nearly 60 years before. Another, Colonel Ames of Fort Chartres, died during the colonial wars. The accuracy was impossible. The following spring, amid tensions that would soon erupt into Bleeding Kansas, a group of armed men arrived from the western borderlands. They were searching for runaways rumored to be hiding in the Ozark passes. When asked if he'd seen any fugitives, Isaac told them quietly, "Every man running north is following my footsteps." They beat him for insolence, but witnesses swore the blows left no mark. One of the men, Tobias Reel, later testified that his rifle misfired 3 times that night, the barrel turning black as if burned from within. Not long after, strange weather swept the ridge. The rain fell warm while frost still rimed the ground, and lightning struck the same clearing 7 times in a row without sound. Isaac disappeared soon after the storm. The only trace left was the folded letter he had once carried, found nailed to the stable wall, its ink bleeding through. He cannot die where the ground remembers him. Years later, surveyors discovered something unusual near Merrill Mine Hollow, a place long whispered about by settlers. Beneath a layer of charred stone lay dozens of footprints pressed deep into the clay, bare, perfectly preserved, crossing one another like tracks in ash. They led nowhere, beginning and ending within a circle of burned earth. Some said it was where the old man had walked when the storm came. Others said it was where he finally stopped walking at all. But the truth, if it existed, would not stay buried long. Because by the time the Bleeding Kansas violence reached the border in 1855, witnesses were already reporting that an elderly black man was guiding refugees through the forests, moving like wind, leaving no trail, never sleeping and never aging. By 1856, the Ozark Highlands lay at the edge of a growing storm. The border between Missouri and Kansas had turned red with vengeance. Militias burned homesteads by day and hunted men by torchlight by night. Yet through that chaos, a legend began to spread from the southern trails, of an old black man who guided fugitives north, leading them through the forests without map or lantern, never resting, never captured. Those who survived the journey called him the Gray Walker. But among the enslaved, whispered in prayer and fear alike, his name was spoken clearly: Isaac Granger. Reports began surfacing in freedmen's letters and local testimonies compiled years later by abolitionist committees. They told of a man who could find his way through fog thicker than darkness, who knew every river crossing and ridge pass by heart. One runaway said he spoke with authority, though his voice never rose. He told me, the man wrote, that he'd crossed this ground before when it had no name, and that I'd do the same one day. The most credible account came from Dr. Elisha Ward, a Unionist physician who operated a hidden clinic near Jefferson City. His field journal from 1857 contains an entry that still puzzles historians. Met an aged freedman traveling alone. His bearing calm, his speech exact. Claimed to have seen the same sickness 50 years ago in another war. Impossible, for the fever was new. He showed me a scar on his shoulder, clean, white, smooth as melted wax. No scar ages like that. Around this time, regional papers began referencing him indirectly. The Missouri Courier ran a brief column on the immortal guide of the Ozarks. They dismissed it as superstition, but one editor admitted privately that local slave patrols had tried, and failed, to track a single barefoot man whose footprints never seemed to fade, even in rain. The violence of Bleeding Kansas reached its height that same year, and refugees poured through the Ozarks toward freedom. Many said they were led by a man whose age could not be guessed, whose eyes shone like wet stone, and whose words left the air trembling. He told them not to thank him. "I'm just walking again," he said. But the strangest account came from a Confederate deserter decades later. In his affidavit, he recalled being lost in the mountains after a skirmish near Rolla. He met an old man sitting by a creek, warming his hands though there was no fire. When he asked if he could share the heat, the man replied, "You already have." The soldier awoke the next morning on the main road, uninjured, his boots dry though rain had fallen all night. When told this story, locals nodded knowingly. To them, Isaac was no myth. He was part of the land itself, a man who remembered every path, every loss, every promise broken between the ridges. And so the legend deepened. Wherever storms gathered without thunder, they said that was where he walked, between centuries, between wars, always a step ahead of time. By 1858, the war between slave and free had turned the Ozark border into a trembling fault line. Towns rose and fell within months, burned, rebuilt, and burned again. But through the chaos, there were stories, murmured between wagon drivers and whispered in the dark corners of churches, of a man who appeared at night to lead travelers out of danger, barefoot, silent, carrying a light that wasn't flame. A Union sympathizer named Mrs. Naomi Fletcher later testified that she saw him on such a night. He stood at the crossroads, pointing west with a lantern that glowed like water. The fog didn't touch him. I thought he was a ghost till I saw his breath. The woman followed him for 3 miles through pitch-dark forest and came upon a path she'd never known. At its end was safety, a station of the Underground Railroad hidden beneath a cooper's shop. When she turned to thank him, he was gone. Similar stories echoed across the Ozark Plateau, each different, yet the same in detail. An impossibly old black man, unbent by years, who knew every ridge and river crossing. Some called him Isaac the Guide, others the man who wouldn't die. And while few dared to claim they met him twice, all described his calm voice and the faint metallic smell that hung in the air after he passed, like lightning hiding beneath the wind. That same year, a minister from Jefferson City, Reverend John Petherbridge, published a pamphlet warning against the heresy of the eternal slave, arguing that this Granger was a trick of the devil meant to tempt abolitionists into false prophecy. But his words carried no weight. For every sermon that denounced Isaac, 2 new testimonies emerged describing his kindness, his guidance, and his eerie knowledge of storms. In one remarkable incident recorded by Major Aaron Lusk of the Missouri Volunteers, a detachment of soldiers chasing deserters found themselves trapped by floodwaters near Marrow Mine Hollow. At dusk, a man appeared on the ridge, motioning wordlessly toward a low pass that wasn't marked on any map. They crossed safely. The next morning, when Lusk tried to thank him, he found no trace of footprints, only dry earth and a single line etched into the mud. The road remembers who walks it. By 1859, Isaac had become something larger than a man, half memory, half geography. To enslaved people, he was proof of divine deliverance. To soldiers, he was a rumor of conscience walking the earth. To scholars, he was an impossibility, an echo from before the war that refused to fade. When the first cannon of the Civil War sounded 2 years later, the people of the Ozark Highlands already said that Isaac had known it would come. And as troops began marching through the valleys, witnesses again swore they saw him, always ahead of the armies, always walking toward the thunder, as if following something that had called his name centuries ago. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Missouri split in two, brother against brother, ridge against ridge. The Ozark Highlands became both refuge and battlefield, and the border towns of Rolla and Springfield turned into crossroads of rumor. But amid the cannon fire and shifting loyalties, the story of Isaac Granger persisted, growing into something soldiers spoke of in whispers beside dying campfires. Union scouts reported seeing an old black man walking alone at twilight, always moving west, never hurrying. Confederate sentries told the same tale, but from the opposite direction. Each believed he was one of theirs until they saw his face, unlined yet ancient, eyes reflecting the firelight as though remembering another war entirely. A letter from Captain R.W. Holton to his wife, dated September 1862, describes an encounter near Wilson's Creek, one of the bloodiest battles in Missouri. He stood by the road as we marched, head uncovered, lantern dim though the sun was up. I thought him a runaway until I saw him again that night in the same place, standing still as stone. I ordered him to move on. He replied, "I've already seen this day once before." After the battle, soldiers swore they found him walking the field, whispering over the fallen, calling them by name though he could not have known them. A private claimed he heard him murmur, "Not yet, not this time." Later, in 1863, a missionary nurse with the U.S. Sanitary Commission recorded tending to a fevered man who spoke of a dark angel with no wings, who guided the wounded to safety before vanishing. She described finding muddy footprints that dried into the floorboards overnight and could not be scrubbed away. Even military records mention him obliquely. One field report filed under unidentified civilian presence reads, "Seen traveling between lines, unarmed, unmolested, indifferent to gunfire. Locals call him Granger, claims to remember other wars. Not enemy, not ally." That same year, the Battle of Pea Ridge raged just south of the Highlands. Men who fought there said the storm that followed the fighting rolled without lightning, only a deep trembling sound that set their teeth on edge. When it cleared, the road was marked by a single trail of footprints burned into the clay, bare, deep, perfectly spaced. In the aftermath, veterans swore that wherever the air went still before rain, that was where he walked. They called him the Watcher, believing he gathered the names of the dead so they would not vanish into the noise of war. And when peace finally came, those who returned home found him again, older and unchanged, standing by the roads leading into the hills, lantern glowing softly, as if still waiting for something the rest of the world had forgotten to finish. When the war ended in 1865, the Ozark Highlands did not celebrate. The soldiers came home to burned farms and hollow valleys, and the freed people found themselves in a world that had changed only in name. Yet, through the years of rebuilding, the figure of Isaac Granger continued to wander the ridges like unfinished business. In 1867, a newly formed branch of the Freedmen's Bureau documented strange testimonies from refugees along the Gasconade River. Many spoke of an old man with a lantern who came in the night, offering them food and direction northward, though he seemed to need none himself. One woman described him as smiling kindly but not from joy, like someone remembering what the sky used to sound like. A Union veteran, Sergeant Milton Rhodes, claimed he saw him too, walking barefoot along the same trail where an entire company had been buried after a flash flood. He wasn't mourning them, Rhodes told a bureau agent. He was counting them. That phrase appeared again years later in county ledgers, in sermons, even in children's rhymes. The man who counts the ground, they called him. By the 1870s, when Reconstruction fatigue hollowed the state, sightings of Isaac became rarer but never ceased. The St. Louis Chronicle published a brief article describing an unaged Negro of curious bearing, who reportedly passed through several towns on foot, seeking neither lodging nor charity. He was seen pausing at graveyards, murmuring names, then walking away before anyone approached. The editor dismissed it as local folklore, but a note in the paper's margin, written in pencil by a typesetter, read, "We saw him too." That same decade, surveyors returning to the old Marrow Mine Hollow found the earth strangely altered. Patches of soil were fused into smooth black stone as if struck by heat without fire. No grass grew there. When one worker tried to dig, his shovel's edge sparked faintly, though the day was clear. The report was filed and forgotten. It was the same year that the Ozarks endured a lightning storm that lasted through an entire night, thunder rolling without pause, rain falling in brief bursts like exhaled breath. Come morning, a single barefoot trail ran from the hollow to the ridge above Rolla, every footprint filled with water that did not dry for days. No one doubted who had walked there. By the century's end, the old-timers said Isaac Granger was still alive, still wandering between storms, unaging, unburied. Some said he was keeping a promise no one else remembered. Others said he was waiting for the earth itself to forget what it had done. And whenever the air grew still before rain, the people of the Ozarks would pause, listening, not for thunder, but for the sound of steady steps moving through the silence. By 1871, the Ozark Highlands had changed. The war had ended 6 years before, but its echo lingered in the hollow valleys where soldiers once hid and the enslaved had walked toward freedom. The mines reopened, the churches rebuilt, and the old trails grew over with moss. Only one thing did not change: the quiet murmur that Isaac Granger still walked the ridges. In Rolla, a merchant named Clarence Red swore that an elderly man visited his shop every spring. He never bought anything, but he'd rest his hands on the countertop as if testing its grain. Red said, He had the eyes of a man who remembered the first saw cut into the first tree. The strangest part, those hands left no dust. The counter stayed cold, Red told his grandson years later. Around that time, a railway survey team pushing through Phelps County reported unexplained interference in their compasses. Their engineer, Thomas Greer, blamed magnetite in the soil, but one night, while charting the ridgeline, he and his crew found an unlit lantern resting on a rock outcropping. The glass was clean, the metal warm, though no one had touched it. Greer kept it in his tent overnight. When he woke, the lantern was gone, replaced by a footprint pressed deep into the frozen mud, bare, human, and faintly steaming. He filed no report. The next confirmed sighting came from a freedwoman named Evelyn Coates, who lived near the Gasconade River. She told a traveling minister that she'd met an old man carrying a lantern bright as a star. He said her husband, who had died in the war, was buried too shallow, and that the ground hums when it's restless. Terrified, she later dug near the riverbank and uncovered a half-collapsed wooden box filled with waterlogged uniform cloth. Inside was a name tag, Coates. When word spread, the preacher urged people to beware of the old one who digs up what God has buried. But the townsfolk didn't listen. They began leaving bread and candles by the road, small offerings for the man who watches. For the poor and the newly freed, Isaac had become a comfort, a walking testament that memory was stronger than erasure. Yet even his believers feared the nights when storms moved without wind. In those moments, when thunder trembled but rain did not fall, they swore they could see his figure outlined on the ridges, the lantern glowing blue instead of gold. Old miners said that meant the earth itself was remembering, and that Isaac was the one keeping count. One farmer put it best: "If he's alive, he's not living like we do, and if he's dead, then dying don't mean much anymore." By then the Ozarks had learned to live with him, not as miracle or curse, but as proof that history itself sometimes refused to lie still. By 1873, Missouri was rebuilding, yet in the Ozark Highlands, time seemed to falter. The mines reopened, schools returned, and railroads crept through the valleys, but the people of Rolla and Phelps County still spoke of the same unaging figure seen walking before storms. The war had ended, but the watchers said Isaac Granger had not. That year, a surveyor from the Springfield Geological Office, Merritt Cohen, was sent to document mineral veins near Marrow Mine Hollow, the same place that had long been whispered as Isaac's haunt. His journal, preserved in the Missouri State Archives, reads almost like confession. "The hollow feels wrong, not haunted, more like awake. My compass spins and I hear something below, steady as a heartbeat in the ground." Cohen's assistant left after the first week, claiming he saw a man standing at the mine entrance holding a lantern that gave off no smoke. Cohen stayed alone another night and recorded one final entry. He said his name like it was an old song. "Isaac," he told me and smiled. I asked what he was doing here. He said, "Keeping count." Then the light went out. When a rescue team arrived, they found the instruments melted and the walls of the mine fused into smooth stone, as if brushed by lightning that left no burn. Cohen was never found. Yet when the mine reopened decades later, workers unearthed a lantern identical to the one Isaac was known to carry. The wick was unburned and the glass still warm. From that time forward, locals began to avoid the ridge entirely. Travelers said the air there hummed faintly, like a drum heard through soil. Old farmers claimed it grew louder when they spoke Isaac's name aloud. "He listens through the ground," they warned. Around the same time, a wandering preacher named Hiram Wells passed through the area, giving sermons against superstition. On a stormy night in October, he dared the townsfolk to follow him to the hollow and prove that no ghost walked among men. Only 2 accompanied him. They returned pale and trembling, speaking of blue light flickering beneath the earth and a voice that said, "You are late. I've been walking long enough." Wells himself was never seen again. His Bible was found open at the ridge's edge, its pages fused together. By winter, the story of Isaac Granger had turned from fear into something else: reverence. Some said he was a curse, others a guardian, the living memory of every injustice carved into the land. Children born that year were warned never to follow strange lights in the woods, for they belonged to the man who measures the silence. And on those still, heavy nights before thunder, the hollow would hum softly again, as though someone beneath was counting, slow and patient, waiting for the next century to arrive. By 1876, progress had returned to most of Missouri, but not to the hollow. Benton Creek lay quiet beneath fog that never fully lifted, and Rolla's townsfolk avoided the ridge after sunset. They said the storms there didn't break, they only circled. And when thunder rolled too softly to echo, it meant Isaac Granger was walking again. That autumn, Sheriff Dunn received a series of complaints from farmers whose fences had come apart overnight. The wood wasn't stolen or broken, just unfastened, the nails laid neatly on top of each post as if someone had undone the land itself. Dunn rode out to inspect and found the soil strangely smooth, as though a current had passed through it. His report, filed weeks later, read: "No human footprints, no wagon, only one mark, round and deep, as though a man had stood long enough for the earth to sag beneath him." 3 nights after that, lightning struck the old mine ridge again. The bolt made no sound, and the light lingered for nearly a full minute. When it faded, Dunn saw a figure outlined against the trees, tall, still, and carrying a pale lantern. He tried to ride forward, but his horse reared and fled. It wasn't fear, he later told the town minister, it was respect. Soon after, the Ozark Sentinel published an unsigned column, "The Man Who Counts the Rain." The writer claimed that Granger appeared before storms as a sign of reckoning, that each drop of rain was a soul he named so it will not be forgotten. The paper was ridiculed, but 2 weeks later, one of its editors went missing while traveling to Springfield. His satchel was found at the edge of Benton Creek, bone dry in a rainstorm. Inside was his unfinished draft. The last sentence read, "He walks not against time but beside it." Meanwhile, a former Union chaplain, Reverend Miles Weatherby, began collecting testimonies about the old man, hoping to prove or disprove his existence. He interviewed soldiers, widows, and miners, all telling the same story: the lantern, the silence, the unchanging face. Weatherby grew obsessed. His last diary entry, dated November 12, 1876, reads, "If I find him, I'll ask what he remembers of the first morning. The wind will answer if he cannot." He vanished that night. Only his Bible returned, found open on a rock ledge above the hollow, its ink smeared by dew that hadn't yet fallen. By winter, people stopped speaking of Isaac altogether, not from disbelief but fatigue. It was said he had outlasted fear itself. And though no one claimed to see him for years after, the hollow stayed strangely warm in winter, and the ground there never froze. Old men said that was his doing, that the land had learned to keep itself alive just as he had. By 1879, Missouri had entered a strange calm. The worst of the war's scars had faded, yet the Ozark Highlands seemed trapped between decades, half wild, half rebuilt, and half awake to something older than both. The people said the ridge slept lightly, and that Isaac Granger still kept watch, walking each storm like a man making his rounds. That summer, a rare weather phenomenon drew notice across the state. For 3 nights, lightning danced over Benton Creek Hollow without thunder. Newspapers called it the still storm, and people from Rolla to Lebanon rode out to see it. They found the valley glowing faintly, as though the air itself had turned phosphorescent. On the second night, a boy named Peter Klein wandered too close and vanished. His father later found him sitting unharmed beside a dry stream, lantern light flickering beside him. When asked who had given it to him, the boy said, "The man who counts the rain." A local teacher, Miss Harriet Boone, who documented the event, wrote, "The night was silent as prayer. No thunder, no wind. Yet the trees bent toward the hollow as though in greeting. And there, in the center of that impossible light, walked a man with a lantern. His shadow never touched the ground." That description mirrored accounts stretching back 30 years. Scholars tried to attribute it to electrical discharge from the mine veins, but the phenomenon ended as suddenly as it began, leaving no mark but fused stones and footprints pressed deep into the ridge. The following month, an old soldier from the Pea Ridge campaign came forward claiming he'd once seen Isaac decades earlier on a battlefield gathering names of the fallen. He recognized him instantly, saying, "He looked the same, only quieter, as though even the war had grown tired of chasing him." By autumn, strange things began happening again. Compasses spinning, animals refusing to drink from the creeks, lights appearing in fog without source. The town constable dismissed it as electrical mischief, but he too kept his windows covered when the clouds rolled low. One night the county clerk, Martha Vale, working late at the courthouse, saw a figure pass her window. She said the man stopped and looked straight at her through the glass. His expression was calm, but his eyes reflected light that wasn't there. She swore she heard him whisper, "Write them down before they forget again." In the morning, her ink bottle was empty, though she'd left it half full. That was the last verified sighting before the century turned. Yet even now, in the older parts of the Ozark Highlands, some barns still keep an unlit lantern hanging by the door. Not for luck or safety, they say, but out of respect for the man who once walked before every storm, reminding the earth that history never truly sleeps. By 1882, the Ozarks had settled into uneasy peace. The war was a story, the freedmen were citizens, and yet the Highlands felt older than ever, like the land itself carried secrets too heavy for memory. Still, those who lived along Benton Creek Hollow whispered that the watchman had not left. The name Isaac Granger had become less man and more warning. That spring, a traveling physician, Dr. Lemuel Cade, passed through Phelps County recording strange atmospheric effects for a study on post-storm illness. His journal, later found in a locked chest in Jefferson City, contained one page so smeared that archivists assumed water damage. But under lamplight, faint lines could still be read. Met an elderly Negro, tall and straight, voice calm. Claimed to have seen the first epidemic of yellow fever in Virginia and the last cholera wave in New Orleans. Dates impossible. I asked how old he was. He said, "I don't keep time anymore. Time keeps me." Cade never submitted his report. He vanished a week later, his medical kit discovered at the edge of the hollow, metal tools tarnished black though untouched by moisture. Meanwhile, local settlers continued their quiet superstitions. Every new family moving near the ridge was told the same thing: hang a lantern on the porch before a storm, it lets him pass. Those who forgot often found their barns standing open by morning, every door unlatched but nothing missing, like a polite visitation. A minister, Reverend Jeb Walling, dismissed such tales until one Sunday night in June. Returning from a late sermon, he crossed the low bridge at Benton Creek and saw a glow on the far bank. Thinking it a fire, he dismounted, but what he found instead was an old man sitting in the reeds, holding a lantern whose light did not waver. Walling later wrote, "He looked at me as though I'd interrupted him mid-thought. He said, 'They still build houses on graves.' I asked who he was. He answered, 'Whoever remembers.' Then the light went out." The next morning, the Reverend's horse was found standing at the parsonage door, reins untied, eyes wide. The man himself didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally addressed his congregation again, his voice shook as he said, "We are not alone in our forgiveness." That autumn, miners from the reopened Marrow Hollow claimed to hear hammering underground where no tunnel existed. Each time lightning flashed, the noise would stop, then begin again after the sky went silent. Foremen blamed echoes, but one miner, old Ezekiel Lowe, said he saw a figure deep in the shafts, walking ahead of his lamp, bare feet on wet stone. He wasn't working, Lowe told his wife later. He was listening. The locals began calling him the listener in the storm, and even those who claimed disbelief started glancing toward the ridges when thunder rolled too quietly, just to make sure the hills were still standing. By 1885, the ridge above Benton Creek had become a line between 2 centuries, the old world of memory and the new age of machinery. The train whistle reached even the smallest valleys now, but it never crossed the hollow. Engineers said their engines lost pressure there, compasses spun, and rails hissed faintly in dry air. They called it the ridge that breathes. That autumn, a young newspaperman from St. Louis named Albert Finch arrived, chasing the story that older editors mocked but never denied, the legend of Isaac Granger, the freedman who refused to die. Finch planned to expose it as folklore. He rented a horse, rode out to the hollow, and found the world unusually still. His journal was discovered weeks later, pages torn but legible. The trees bend as if windless. I heard hammering far off, measured like heartbeats. I followed it to the ridge. There stood a man, tall, weathered lantern in hand. The light had color, blue turning to gold, then back again. He asked me, "Do you know how long the earth takes to forgive?" I told him no. He said, "Neither do I, but I'm still counting." Finch never returned to St. Louis. His horse was found near Rolla, reins tied to a fence, eyes calm. Locals searched the hollow but found only a patch of ground scorched smooth, the soil warm for days afterward. In his satchel beside his half-written article, someone had placed a single note: "Write what you saw, not what they will believe." After that, the sightings became rarer, but when they came, they carried a strange consistency. Farmers said the light of Isaac's lantern had changed. It no longer flickered like fire but pulsed, slow and deliberate, as if syncing with the sound of thunder that never reached the ear. The air around him shimmered faintly, like heat above water. In December, a schoolteacher named Ellen Corby saw him walking along the ridge during snowfall. She told the county clerk. The flakes touched everything but him. He moved like a shadow that forgot what darkness was. The clerk recorded her statement but added no judgment. He knew better. By the close of the decade, the land around the hollow was fenced off for mining surveys, though no company ever worked it. The few who did try found their equipment rusted in days and their lamps extinguished without wind. One foreman, in frustration, hurled his lantern into the hollow. When it struck the ground, it burst into blue light that glowed for nearly an hour. People said it wasn't oil that burned that night, it was memory. And when dawn came, the miners saw new footprints circling their camp, each print pressed deep into frozen soil, as if made by someone impossibly heavy or impossibly patient. By 1888, the Ozarks were filling with new settlers and industry. Telegraph poles marched down the ridges, and the old trails were renamed for businessmen and generals who had never set foot there. But the hollow refused its new masters. The men who drove wire through Benton Creek Ridge said their signal crackled and reversed. Words sent north arrived backward, or not at all. When they went to check the lines, they found no breaks, only a man standing by the posts, lantern glowing low, eyes calm. They said he spoke softly. "You can't teach the ground to forget." He was seen again that winter by Mrs. Elvira Toll, a widow who lived alone near the abandoned mine. She was known for her good sense and her sharp tongue, not one to indulge in ghosts. In a statement she later gave to the sheriff, she said, "He was sitting on the step when I came out with the lantern. I told him he'd catch cold. He smiled and said, 'I've had worse weather.' Then he looked at my porch and said, 'They built this over the road.' I asked what road. He pointed down and said, 'The one I never stop walking.' Then he was gone." No one doubted her. The next day, snow melted only in a perfect line leading from her door to the edge of the ridge. That same year, a small scientific society in Springfield began a study of anomalous ground vibrations in the Ozark region. Their report mentioned steady rhythmic oscillations near Marrow Mine Hollow, measured even on clear days, like a heartbeat buried under stone. When one member tried to investigate further, his compass shattered in his hand. The society eventually abandoned its research, but one of its members, Professor Hollis Brent, wrote privately to a friend, "There's a pulse in that ground that moves slower than any clock but never stops. I think it belongs to him." After that, the name Isaac Granger was rarely spoken aloud. He was no longer legend, nor miracle, nor curse. He was endurance itself, history in its rawest form, refusing to sleep. Children born that decade were warned never to whistle during a thunderstorm because the sound confused the man who walks. And when storms came, mothers set lanterns in the windows, not to guide travelers but to show the old one he was remembered. By the turn of the century, the land above the hollow had changed hands countless times. Each new owner signed a deed that described the property as stable, unremarkable. Yet no one stayed long. The ground hummed, faint but steady, a noise felt more in the bones than in the ear. And those who passed by after dark said they sometimes saw two lights glowing across the valley, one golden and one blue, moving slowly side by side before vanishing into the fog. By 1891, the Ozarks were almost unrecognizable from the frontier of Isaac Granger's youth. Telegraph poles and steel bridges now stretched across valleys that once echoed with gunfire and prayer. But some places refused progress. The ridge above Merrill Mine Hollow remained the same dark, still, and alive with something too old for names. That year, the county court authorized another survey of the land, hoping to sell it to a mining company from St. Louis. The lead surveyor, Franklin Rouse, wrote home often. His letters, found in his descendants' attic generations later, told of a crew uneasy from the start. "The ground hums at night," he wrote. "The air feels like it's watching us." They set up camp near the mouth of the old shaft, but each dawn found their tools moved, arranged in perfect circles. The foreman accused the workers of superstition until one evening, a blue light flared down in the hollow. Thinking it lightning, they ran for cover, yet the sky stayed clear. Rouse described it plainly. A man stood there, tall, unbent, his lamp glowing like the heart of a forge. He said nothing, only looked at us as though we'd walked across his memory. Then the light closed like a fist. By morning, 2 men quit and rode east, refusing to collect pay. Rouse persisted another week before finding the ground around their instruments melted into glass. He packed up and left, writing in his final letter, "Some parts of this country belong to someone older than law." The St. Louis Company withdrew its offer. No map ever charted that hollow again. In 1893, a drought struck Phelps County, drying rivers to cracked beds. Yet near the ridge, a single pool remained full. The farmers said the water glowed faintly when touched by moonlight. A boy who drank from it claimed he heard a man's voice whisper, "You won't thirst long." His fever broke the next day, and the pool vanished by dawn. That same summer, a preacher from the lowlands, Elder Hanby, came to declare the phenomenon blasphemy. He gathered a crowd at the ridge to drive out the spirit of deception. Witnesses said that as he raised his Bible, lightning flashed, but struck behind him, not before. When they opened their eyes, the pages were blank, every word erased. No one held another sermon there. Even the skeptic miners crossed themselves when they passed the hollow. As the century closed, Isaac Granger had become both warning and comfort, a legend of endurance walking the land. The newspapers wrote him off as myth. The people of the Ozarks knew better. On nights when the wind died and the clouds hung too low, they swore they could see his light moving slow along the ridge, gold turning to blue, counting the silence between thunder that never came. By 1895, most who had known the war or its wanderers were gone. The younger generation heard of Isaac Granger only in whispers, a bedtime warning told in calm voices, as if reverence alone kept the land from stirring. But in the mining town of Salem, one man still claimed to have seen him. His name was William Pott, foreman of a short-lived iron venture that tunneled too near the old Marrow Hollow Ridge. He was practical, a man who laughed at superstition. His affidavit, written 3 months before his death, tells a different story. "We struck something below the 3rd layer. Not ore, not rock, something fused, smooth, and warm to the touch. Then the air filled with a low hum. I sent 2 men down to measure it. They never came back up." Pott went down himself with a lantern and found the tunnel empty. No bodies, no tools. Just a single footprint pressed into the clay, half filled with water that glowed faintly blue. He heard someone breathing in the dark and a calm voice saying, "You keep digging what's already open." When the miners tried to flee, their lanterns all went out at once. The next morning, the shaft had collapsed from within. Locals said they saw smoke rising from the ridge, though the ground showed no burn. The mine closed within a week. Months later, Potts sent his report to the Missouri Mining Board, but the letter arrived sealed with black wax. Inside was a single page of shaky handwriting. "He's still here. He's not haunting, he's remembering." The same week, a storm hit Rolla, lightning flashing without sound. Every bell in town rang once and fell silent. People said it was the landmarking time, that Isaac Granger was still walking, counting seconds older than memory itself. By then, travelers through the Ozarks spoke of him with quiet certainty. The freedmen called him Father of the Crossing. Preachers spoke of him as the unburied conscience. And when thunder rolled softly without echo, old farmers removed their hats, whispering, "He's passing by." The ground near Benton Creek began to behave strangely too, crops sprouting early, stones vibrating faintly after rain. Some called it miracle, others curse. The truth, perhaps, was neither. It was the earth alive and remembering. As the century neared its close, the legend of Isaac Granger became something between folklore and geology. He was no longer a man in stories, but a presence in the ridges, the hum before storms, the glow beneath water, the silent patience of time itself. And on the rare nights when the valley filled with mist and the lantern light flickered blue instead of gold, the elders said softly, "The old one's walking again. Keep still, let him pass." By 1897, the century was gasping its last breath, and so were most of those who still remembered when the Ozarks ran wild and word of Isaac Granger passed only in murmurs. Factories hummed now. The sound of saws and rails filled the ridges. Yet amid all the iron and progress, the people said one hill still belonged to him, the one that never echoed when thunder rolled. That spring, the bell at Rolla's old courthouse began to behave strangely. It rang by itself during clear days, and on storm nights, it refused to ring at all. The bell ringer, Silas Ward, climbed the tower one morning to fix the mechanism and found a strange handprint on the brass, large, unburned, and pressed deep enough to leave a visible impression. He tried to polish it away, but the mark darkened under his cloth, turning the color of soot. 2 nights later, a tremor rolled through the valley. The courthouse shook, windows rattling, yet no damage followed. Only the bell moved, swinging once, soundless. When the mayor and sheriff arrived, they found Ward sitting on the steps below, pale and shaking. He said he had seen a man inside the tower, a tall, dark figure holding a lantern whose light glowed blue. The man had touched the bell rope gently and whispered, "It remembers every name it ever rang for." Ward left town the next morning. He never returned. The phenomenon spread. Farms along Benton Creek reported livestock standing silent during storms, faces turned toward the ridge as though listening. Lamps flickered when Isaac's name was mentioned aloud. Even the telegraph office experienced unaccountable pauses in transmission, moments of dead air followed by faint rhythmic clicking, as though a message were coming from underground. A clerk transcribed one fragment before it faded. "Counting, still counting." By autumn, the townspeople had begun to light small lanterns on their porches during rain, some said to honor him, others to keep him away. The minister refused to bless them, calling the practice a prayer for storms. Yet even he left one burning when the clouds grew too heavy. That winter, the courthouse bell fell silent for good. When workmen hoisted it down to repair it, they found the clapper fused to the shell as if melted by lightning. Beneath it, engraved where no craftsman could have reached, were 3 letters carved into the metal's heart. IG. After that, no one doubted he still walked. From that year on, whenever thunder rolled low and far without rain, the people said it wasn't the sky they were hearing. It was the sound of Isaac Granger's lantern swinging somewhere in the dark, marking the end of one century and the beginning of another. By 1899, progress had wrapped the Ozarks in rail and wire, but not even industry could drain the strange power from the valleys. New factories near Rolla sent soot into the sky, Yet the air above Benton Creek Hollow stayed unnaturally clear. The workers joked that the smoke feared the old man's lungs. That winter, the Gasconade River rose beyond memory, flooding the low towns. Boats capsized, barns drifted off their foundations, and the floodwaters swallowed entire homesteads. When the storm cleared, survivors told of a man wading through the water with a lantern held high, moving upstream against the current. A boy from Licking, rescued by a stranger that night, told his mother. He said he was finding names that floated away. He said the river forgets too easy. The women who gathered the bodies found something stranger still. On every wooden plank and barrel that washed ashore, the initials IG appeared faintly scorched, as if by invisible lightning. When the townsmen tried to dismiss it as coincidence, the preacher shook his head and said, "That flood wasn't judgment, it was memory cleaning house." In 1900, the county tried once more to resettle the ridge, selling cheap parcels to new families. None stayed longer than a season. Lamps flickered out each evening, livestock refused to cross the fields, and tools left overnight rusted to powder. One homesteader, George Levens, wrote in a letter to his brother, "The ground moves here when thunder comes. You can feel something walking underneath." When spring arrived, Levens was gone. His house stood empty but perfectly neat, as though he'd simply walked away mid-step. Only one thing was out of place. The hearth held an unlit lantern whose glass glowed faintly even in darkness. The Missouri Geological Survey, curious after years of rumors, sent an investigator that summer. The man reported nothing unusual, except for one final observation. Air unusually ionized, faint hum below hearing. Locals call it the watcher's breath. He submitted his findings, retired early, and left no forwarding address. That autumn, thunder returned to Benton Creek, but not like before. There was no lightning, only the long, rolling sound of something vast turning in its sleep. Old women wept when they heard it. The young did not understand. To them, it was just weather. Yet those who had lived long enough knew it was something else. They said Isaac Granger was walking again, lantern in hand, taking one last count before the century turned, marking every grave, every promise, every forgotten road his footsteps had carved. And on the final night of that century, as the old clock struck midnight and the church bells froze mid-chime, witnesses swore the entire ridge shimmered blue for the length of a single heartbeat. Then all went still. When the new century dawned, the Ozark Highlands woke to quiet skies and clean air. The storms had passed, the floods retreated, and the mines fell silent again. The people of Rolla went on with their lives, raising barns, planting crops, teaching children. But none forgot that final night of 1899 when the ridge burned blue without flame. They spoke of it only as the night the world held its breath. In 1901, a traveling preacher from Arkansas stopped in Benton Creek Valley. His name was Reverend Cal Porter, and his sermons dwelled on endurance, not fear. He had heard the stories of Isaac Granger all his life, yet when he came to the ridge, he felt no dread. The townsfolk told him to keep his lantern low and not to linger. He smiled and said, "If he still walks, I'll walk beside him." The next morning, his congregation found his lantern hanging from a tree branch above the hollow. The wick was cold, but the glass was warm to the touch, glowing faintly from within. Beside it lay a page torn from his Bible, the ink blurred by dew. "The earth shall give up her dead when it remembers their names." After that, no one ventured near at night. Travelers spoke of footsteps keeping pace beside them on the road, even when they walked alone. Some said they glimpsed an old man's reflection in the Gasconade River when no one stood on its banks. The lantern light, they said, was no longer blue or gold. It was white, soft as dawn. The local historian Cora Dinwiddie, writing in 1903, described the legend's hold on the community. "The story of the freedman who lived beyond time has become our conscience in motion. Whether spirit or memory, he remains a reminder that history cannot be buried under silence." But even her careful words carried unease. For in that same year her archive burned in a fire that left every document untouched except one, the earliest ledger recording Isaac Granger's arrival in 1853. The ink had faded to a ghostly gray, yet the signature at the bottom still gleamed as though freshly written. And so the legend outlived the people who tried to end it. Each generation gave him a new name: the watchman, the listener, the lantern man. But the ground itself knew only one. When thunder rolled without rain, when the soil trembled underfoot, when the air filled with that faint metallic hum, the elders would whisper it under their breath. Isaac. To this day, the ridge above Benton Creek Hollow remains unbuilt, untouched, and strangely warm even in snow. Locals say that if you stand there long enough, you can hear the earth breathing, a slow rhythm that matches no heartbeat but feels alive nonetheless. And sometimes, just before dawn, a light moves through the fog, steady, patient, eternal, like a man still walking the boundary between what was forgotten and what refuses to die.